the biggest carbon sinks in the globe are the ocean is by far the biggest. The second is soil, and plant and animal biomass comes a long way after that. There's 4 times as much carbon in all our global soils than there is in all the natural biomass within the planet. So soils matter.
Welcome to the Green Urbanist, a podcast for urbanists fighting climate change. I'm Ross. Today's episode is a conversation with Chris Churchman. Chris is a landscape architect and strategist and the founding director of Churchman, Thornhill, Finch landscape architects. As well as having decades of experience designing stunning projects like the gardens of the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich, Chris is interested in the role of soil in tackling climate change. He joined me to talk about the potential for soil to play a much bigger role in sequestering carbon, consequently how new development on greenfield sites actually releases a lot more carbon than we currently account for, and also some thoughts on urban greening tactics. There's lots of interesting insights in this episode. One thing that jumped out to me in particular, at the end I asked him the question I ask all guests, which is, what do you think needs to happen in the next decade to ensure successful climate action? He said that if we found some silver bullet technology to suck carbon out of the atmosphere, we would miss out on all of the potential benefits of solving climate change the right way, by restoring nature and changing our consumerist lifestyles. In his mind, there is a lot to be gained by taking drastic action on climate change, which is something I definitely agree with. Sorry for the spoiler, but I just thought that was such an interesting thought that I wanted to share it up front. Listen to the very end to hear him say it in his own words. Finally, I just want to give a little plug for my own work. I recently changed job and I'm now working at a non-profit called Design Southeast. Our mission is to improve the design quality and sustainability of new development across the southeast of England and support local authorities with training and objective advice. This is actually where I made contact with Chris, as he sits on one of our design review panels. So if you're in the southeast and you're in need of some urban design training, design review, or assistance with community engagement, we would love to work with you. Find out more at designsoutheast.org. Okay, that's it for the plug and the introduction. For now, enjoy my conversation with Chris. All right, Chris, welcome to the Green Urbanist podcast. Great to have you.
Hi, good evening.
Can you just begin by telling us a bit about yourself, please?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a landscape architect, and I have been a landscape architect for nearly 50 years now, boy and man. So from starting my education and then through my career, that's the sort of time span that we're looking at. I started very much as a traditional landscape architect and have been that for most of my professional life. I run a practice with two other directors. It was originally my practice. I set it up in 1993. We have two other directors, one who joined in 2007, another joined in 2014. And so now we operate from two offices in the UK. So one is in Bristol and then second office in London, where myself and Andrew are based. So, as I say, although I started out as a landscape architect, pure and simple, and have been that most of my professional life, over the last decade, I suppose, I've drifted more and more into environmental science, I suppose, and so I see myself now as a landscape strategist. And I suppose if I have a future career after 50 years, then that's where I see things going. It's certainly what interests me. Obviously, with COP26, that's put a whole new sort of emphasis onto things like that. But I think a lot of our projects are sort of starting to move in that direction as well. Based in the UK, our projects that you may know. So for those of you who aren't in the UK, then National Maritime Museum in Greenwich would be one of our signature schemes. We've also worked at the Tower of London. And you may, through Design or through any of the sort of design online design magazines, you may know some of our other projects. So South Gardens or Elephant Park for the Australian developer Lendlease, which we completed in 2016-17 and won a lot of accolades for. And then more recently, 2020, we were award winners for the Green University of Birmingham. So that's had quite a lot of coverage in the European press. So all of those are available. They're all sort of visible on our website.
Brilliant. I think you're the first actual landscape architect I've had on the podcast in something like 35 episodes, which is an
Okay,
absolute
good to hear.
crime, because because I am a huge supporter of the landscape architecture profession. I certainly agree with a landscape led approach when you're dealing with urban design. So
Yeah.
I don't know why it's taken me so long to invite a or indeed a landscape strategist on. So you're very welcome. One thing that we got talking about previously that I want you to flesh out a little bit more is, in the UK, and I'm sure in many other countries as well, delivering on housing targets and delivering homes for a growing population means a lot of transformation of what was agricultural land or rural land into what is now paved over suburbia or urban development of some kind.
Yeah.
With that comes a lot of loss of soil, and this is something that you flagged up to me is actually very, very serious and is not really being talked about. So could you flesh that out a little bit for us?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose to put that in context, one of the discussions, the forums last week at COP, architect Stephen Hodder, who's head of the Construction Council, got up and he was talking about development, and he said that every week there is a development area the size of Paris, which is built out, obviously globally, not in the
Yeah.
UK. Although the UK certainly does its bit to add to that sort of big pie, but nevertheless, you are building an area of that sort of magnitude week on week on week. And so he said that, and it wasn't with any sort of degree of chutzpah or isn't that fantastic? But equally, there wasn't a sort of sense of lament or regret. But I mean, clearly there is a negative to that if you're building out an area which is the size of Paris, then it means you're losing an area the size of Paris in terms of natural assets. And so, you're losing an area of rainforest the size of Paris, or an area of tundra the size of Paris, or an area of Arctic polar ice cap. At the end of the day, there is a loss of natural capital. And the problem is, of course, that you can keep on building, but if you're reducing your sort of natural capital, then you're reducing nature's ability to offset unavoidable emissions. So essentially, climate change or net zero, which I'm sure this is just as much applicable in the States and across Europe. Net zero is a sort of, that's the target for everyone. So what does net zero mean? We've got to ask ourselves that. What is net zero all about? Well, it's about a state of balance. So man has always generated carbon, and that's a natural state of affairs. Well, it's not natural; it's obviously unnatural, but it is the way mankind has evolved. That whatever we do, any sort of process, any mechanical process, where we make something, there is a sort of carbon output that comes out of that, and nature has always been able to offset that. So nature has always had the ability to absorb carbon. It is a huge carbon sink. So the biggest carbon sinks in the globe are the ocean is by far the biggest. The second is soil, and plant and animal biomass comes a long way after that. There's 4 times as much carbon in all our global soils than there is in all the natural biomass within the planet. So soils matter, and the problem is that no one has really sort of twigged what they have now. But for a long time, they didn't twig the fact that our soils are a huge source of, but they're a big carbon bank, basically a carbon source. Now, the reason why this is really important is that soils are obviously a very sort of unstable state. Whilst you do nothing with them, particularly while you leave them covered with grass, then they don't generate carbon. The carbon's locked in up to a depth of about a metre or so. And in quite big quantities. I mean, your average amount of tonnage of carbon within a hectare of soil will vary between as a low point 30 tons per hectare,
Wow.
and it will commonly be well over 100,
Wow.
and commonly up to 200, and it can go to 1,000 in the most extremely rich carbon rich soils. It will be 1,000 tons of carbon per hectare. Now the problem is that if you're building on greenfield sites and on natural soils, you're stripping those soils. So that carbon, it doesn't go with the soil, it goes into the atmosphere. So essentially, that carbon, when you expose it, when you strip it, generates carbon dioxide. The atmosphere just picks it up, and it becomes another output of carbon. So if you're building at low densities, and for the UK, which is a very densely developed country, where I think if you look at the world rankings, I think we're about 30th in terms of most densely developed countries. I mean, all the big superpowers, so Russia, China, America, are all like 150 to 200. I mean, they're very, sparse populations. So if you're building at a density which is very low, which for us would be 20 or less dwellings per hectare,
Okay.
then and you've got 200 tons of carbon per hectare, then basically, you've got, for every house you're building, you're losing 10 tons of carbon. And if you had 1,000 tons of carbon in your soil, then obviously, and you're building at 20 per hectare, then you're releasing 50 tons of carbon into the atmosphere. And then you go to equivalents, of course. So the equivalent, carbon dioxide equivalent, is 3.67 times a ton of carbon. So one TC equals 3.67 T CO2 equivalents. So these become big numbers. So the UK at the moment is, on the one hand, is driving towards net zero, which is fantastic. That's what it should be doing. But it also, has a real pressing need in terms of housing, and it's looking to build 300,000 new homes per annum. Now, obviously, some of those are going to be in cities, but the vast majority, one assumes, wouldn't be, that they'll be on green fields. And so if you're building 300,000 homes per annum, and they're each releasing, say, 5 tons of carbon, that's 1.5 million tons of carbon dioxide that you're sticking out. Well, actually, it's actually 5 million tons of carbon dioxide, because you have to multiply by a factor of 3.67. So it's 1.5 million tons of carbon, which converts to 5 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So that, is a mega problem. And if you're driving down your natural capital all the time, and your natural capital is what absorbs carbon, naturally absorbs carbon, then you're constantly making it more and more difficult for the natural capital to absorb the outputs of building effectively. So the UK, as I said before, it's a densely developed country, but it still is only 5% developed. 95% of our country is still green, and that's fields, forestry, or wilderness. Globally, it's like 2.5% of the planet is actually built on. The rest is still, well, if you go to the big three, is Russia, China, America, then a lot of it is still just native. It's still the way it was. Exactly. It's never had any sort of management, any development whatsoever. So, as humanity, if we're building out something the size of Paris every week, it's going to be a while before it becomes a fundamental problem. But it is moving in the wrong direction. And if we're all heading for, if we're all trying to get to net zero, and we all have to play whatever part we can in that process, because to get 2/3 of a reduction of our carbon outputs in the next 9 years, which is what we've been told we've got to do,
right?
That's a quantum shift in the way we're all going to live our lives. Every aspect of our lives will have to change to deliver anything like that. And certainly, if we start missing 1.5 as a target and go towards 2 and 2 plus,
Mm,
we'll be driven towards complete changes in our lifestyle. Because if
yeah.
we don't, then we're all screwed basically. So there is a real necessity for all of us, whatever sector we come from, to deliver, and for those who are concerned with our natural assets, then I think they have a huge part to play.
Yeah.
And that was the message coming out of COP26, that for the first time, I think that everybody else got the fact that nature and natural capital is critical. You can't not deliver carbon sequestration through nature, because it's the biggest natural asset that we've got.
Yeah.
I think we ignore it at our peril.
Yeah, it's I think when you look at, for instance, you can see the split of greenhouse gas emissions in the UK, and you will see the emissions from soils in the sort of land use
Yeah,
change
yeah,
category, which is a tiny
yeah, sure.
sliver of that sort of pie chart. So overall it is still like a very small piece. But if you start to drill down into, us, we'll say, the smaller um the responsibilities of smaller actors. So for instance, the construction industry is one subset, of the UK's
Mm,
emissions, and if
mm,
if they are the ones that are maybe driving this soil loss, designers, planners,
mm,
the construction industry in general,
mm.
and we're not thinking about this, well, then that is a larger part of that sort of our smaller pie chart, So that, and if we're
Yeah.
not thinking about it, no one else is thinking about it. It's
Well,
just not going to get dealt
I mean,
with. Yeah,
the sort of slice of the pie related to agriculture and soils isn't that small. It's 12% of the UK's output. I'm not sure what it is globally or in terms of the states, but it's not a small. It's not
mm,
insignificant as a piece of the pie chart. So
sure.
agriculture at the moment is not run sustainably. It's run
Mm,
very inefficiently, and that's largely to do with the common agricultural policy. So for those of you in the States, common agricultural policy was brought in out in the 50s, 60s, I think. And essentially it controlled the agricultural outputs of all of the nations within the sort of EU bloc. And it worked on a series of subsidies, basically. And the basic essence of the way the CAP worked was that if you farmed a piece of land, however inefficiently you farmed it, you got the same subsidy. So
mm,
whether you were farming highly efficiently on some fantastic piece of very rich soil in the south of England or wherever, you were getting the same money as somebody in southern Europe who was farming some highly marginalised piece of land. And that is still the case. The cap still exists, of course, for all of the other EU nations.
mm,
The cap still exists. Fortunately, the UK's now out of it, but even in the UK, we have our own subsidies
yeah.
for doing the wrong thing.
Mm,
So the biggest, if you want to sequester carbon naturally, the best way to do it is with a peat bog. And
yeah.
the UK has an abundance of peat bogs, but a lot of them, it's only got about 5% of what it had 500 years ago, because it's drained them all. And the problem is, when you go from a saturated state and the peat bog then is stable and the carbon is locked in, and then you drain it and try to farm it, all that, it's highly unstable. And
Mm,
so it becomes a huge carbon emitter. And so
yeah.
there's a lot of farmland in the east of England, which is really it's not a great idea to be farming it. I mean, because it's just emitting carbon. The big source of methane for
Mm,
us, or there's two big sources of methane from an agricultural perspective. One's livestock, and the other is fertilizer application. So people drain their peat bog. The peat bog is fantastic for growing crops on for about 5 years, and then it
mm,
gets depleted. So you then throw fertilizer at it, which generates methane.
yeah.
Um, so a lot of those things have to be unraveled and unwound.
Yeah. I'd be interested to know your thoughts on making actually use of livestock to restore the quality of soil.
Yes. So I have to confess, I'm not an expert on this. My
Sure.
understanding is that the only way to actually drive up the sequestration rates is to reduce your grazing numbers, to
Mm,
reduce the number of cattle on your land. Now, I suspect there are other ways. So I have seen examples where some people don't actually, if actually, effectively, they go to factory farming where they have their cattle in a shed and they cut the grass and bring it to them. So
yeah.
it's sort of free range. So it's not free; it's the opposite, free range
Yeah.
dairy. Dairy, I suppose. I mean, that's obviously another way of doing it. Yeah, but I mean, obviously, the other issue, of course, with all ruminants is that they produce methane themselves,
Yeah.
and they're a huge producer of methane.
It's tricky with the whole. I find the whole agriculture topic around climate change very very tricky because it does feel like a lot of the solutions that are suggested are moving further and further away from how food actually naturally grows. So it's about making more efficient livestock is like sticking them in sheds away from
Sure.
fields and growing doing like vertical farms and very highly intensive stuff in greenhouses. And I just
Yeah.
wonder actually how good is that in the long run.
Well, I mean, that's an interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting point. I don't think it is. It has to be that way. Um, so I don't know if you've read the book by James Rebanks. So he's written two books basically, and if you haven't read them, if your readers haven't, if your listeners haven't got hold of them, they should definitely get hold of them because he's a Cumbrian fell farmer,
Hmm.
and he realised that a lot of the ills of his farm were because of practices that had been developed over a 50-year period, basically, which were
Hmm.
moving. It wasn't industrial scale farming because you can't do industrial scale sheep farming on the fells. It's a contradiction in terms. But he realised that he'd lost all the nature, but also the runoff from his land because
Hmm.
over a number of generations, farmers had straightened out watercourses. And so it meant that when they get flooding, which they do regularly in that part of the world, it was epically more than it had ever been. And the reason was because everyone was just sticking all the water down these very straight channels that all created. And
Ah,
so
yeah.
all of the natural winding watercourses had been lost. And so now he and quite a few others are starting to revert to that more natural way of farming. I mean, you are always going to get mechanistic industrial scale farming. I mean, it's a given. But there is obviously clearly in the UK now, and probably globally, there is a shift towards rewilding. I mean,
Hmm.
also one of the government agencies responsible for climate change has said that in the next, I think it's by 2050, maybe it's even less than that, we have to lose 20% of our farmland,
Oh
taking that sort of
wow.
active production because it doesn't stack up financially. And
Right.
from any perspective, it just doesn't work. So if it's not going to be farmland anymore, what is it going to be? Is it all going to be forest? Or is that how we're going to cover our landscape, or is it going to be wilderness? Maybe it is. Maybe massive scale rewilding is the way that
Yeah.
this country will go. But
That's
I think there is another side to it that I think that there are new ideas coming on stream, which are about taking a more scientific approach to the way that you farm without losing the sort of essence of farming.
hmm.
So I've been aware for a while of um, a product which is now available. In the UK, it's available as fantastically named volcanic rock dust, but um, this is basically a case of accelerated mineralization. Um, so what you do, sorry, I'll give you the proper name. So it is um, enhanced silicate rock weathering.
Hmm. Okay.
What this involves is that you buy in crushed rock, and the rock itself is It's not any old rock, obviously. It's normally basalt that is what you acquire, but there are other rocks which I think they're silicate based, obviously. So it's either basalt or magnesium. And what you do is that you buy it as a sort of powder or granular material, a bit like a fertilizer,
Okay.
and you spread it on your land. And what happens is that rainfall, when it comes down to earth, is slightly acidic because of the amount of carbon dioxide that it's absorbed as it comes down.
Okay.
So by the time it hits the soil, then it's laden with a sort of carbon load. So there is a natural process when any piece of rock is hit by rainfall. It dissolves basically over many centuries and millennia. It dissolves.
Sure.
So by creating this powder, you are effectively accelerating that natural process, and so
Right.
the rock granules are getting rainfall, and that pulls bicarbonate out of the rainfall solution. That stays in suspension. It goes down through the soil, works its way into our rivers, and finishes up in our oceans. So this particular process, this enhanced weathering process, enhanced silicate rock weathering, can increase your sequestration by 50%.
Oh, wow.
So if we all did it, even at a small scale in your garden, but certainly if you did it on a macro scale through our agricultural landscape, then you are talking big numbers. I mean, the estimate is that through this process, they can remove 2 billion tons of carbon per year, and the global output at the moment is 35.5 billion tons. Now, okay, so that's still two billion as opposed to 35, so it's less than 10%. But the thing is that 35.5 is going to come down because it has to come down. It's going to come down dramatically. So that's likely to be getting down to certainly 20 and maybe less. So if you're still bringing 2 billion of sequestration through this particular process, then you're into 10% plus territory, and then it becomes a real game changer. It's never going to solve the problem of the world, although the French in 2015 did claim it would. So they had this strategy called 4 per mille,
Oh,
and
yes, I've heard of this.
they said that if you increased the carbon sequestration potential of soil, all our soils, by 0.4%, then climate change would just go away. You wouldn't have to deal with anything because all of the global outputs of carbon would be dealt with just through soil. Now, I think people who are producing the rock dust are suggesting that isn't actually the case. That's never likely to happen. But there certainly are. It certainly is an avenue that is worth going down. That's worth looking at, and just generally, farmers going from a position of being net emitters to net savers, net guardians, I suppose, of carbon. That has to be the way to go.
I think that's all so fascinating, and I think as well, when we think of sequestration, we think of forests and trees.
Yeah.
Maybe just because it's more sort of charismatic.
Well, there is a lot of truth in that. So I always feel that the reason trees get good press and soil gets crap press is because politicians like having their photo taken with planting a tree. And also it's easy to say, we're going to plant 6 billion trees. And so the last UK election, it was this crazy scenario where each of the parties was trying to outbid each other, the numbers of trees. But I did some calculations once because I didn't believe. So at the moment, the UK is planning to build these 300,000 new homes per year, and it's also planning to plant 30,000 hectares of woodland per year as the sort of offsetting. And so basically the this is supposed to go on to 2060. So we're supposed to be building that number of houses until 2060 and planting this number of trees until 2060. And I worked out that if you did that, you would have a forest that was essentially the whole of the western end of England. So from Bristol down to Land's End would just be one continuous forest. And then I thought, well, is this actually true? So what I realised was that no one was factoring in all this lost carbon from soil. So I added that into the mix. And what it did, it told you that you'd have to plant a forest which goes from the south coast to the Mersey and the Wash with one forest, or the other way down. You'd have to come all the way down from Scotland to Newcastle to actually offset all of the carbon emissions if you factored in the amount of soil that we're likely, soil destruction that we're likely to get. So, yeah, I mean, that's where I have problem with the planning system in this country, but also the metrics that the government pushes out. That their metrics aren't aligned. It seems that the guys who are planning the housing numbers for very good reason haven't spoken to the guys who are thinking about how many trees they need to plant, because clearly they're not on the same page. Which is rather ridiculous. And there is no plan. This is the other problem in this country. Yeah. There is no plan. So the planning system is set up it's effectively a charge to build. So it's set up to deal with cities and suburbs, but there is no plan for the green bit, for the 95 that isn't built on. There's no planning system as such. Now, in the UK, there's good soils and there's bad soils. So some soils, which are very sandy and free draining, will only have, and particularly if they've had arable crops on them, they only have about 25 tonnes per hectare of carbon. But, good soils, which tend to be more towards the north, where it's more of a rural, it's more of a pastoral farming system, and probably the West Country, they're into 200 plus tonnes per hectare. So in a way, if you're going to build on greenfield sites, well, you're a lot better building on the stuff which hasn't got much carbon in it, and the stuff which is really a carbon bank and incredibly rich. You should not be building on it. So
yeah, and also the solution to methane emissions from livestock is not to replace livestock farms with arable land, because if you plow the land, you're releasing huge amounts of carbon as well. So
absolutely.
That's like a nuance in the argument that I think has to get through, because I think there's a lot of oversimplification around what has to happen to our food system in terms of, yes, livestock is a problem, but actually, when you bring the soil element into the equation, it gets a bit more complicated. It's a bit less, I wanted to sort of maybe bring the conversation a little bit back to urban areas.
Yep.
And sort of think about, what, obviously our cities are desperately in need of greening as well, of these sort of, richer ecology, a greater biodiversity. And I've talked on the podcast many times about, all the adaptation benefits of that, the benefits to, health, and all this kind of stuff. But I suppose from you as a professional landscape architect, what's your sort of thought process on this, I suppose, and what do you think is important when we're talking about this?
Yeah, so I think in urban areas, public realm, urban greening has a huge value. It isn't going to make any difference from a climate change perspective. And so any claims that it does are really misleading, but it does have other huge benefits, particularly, the vast majority of us still live in cities. And so in a way, what we have to do is make our cities more resilient and more humane, I suppose, more benign. Because, if all the predictions are correct, then there could become quite inhospitable places. And obviously that's something that we can't afford. So there are real benefits, demonstrable benefits from urban greening. Urban greening factor is one way of measuring that. And effectively, urban greening factor is a proxy for a whole range of other issues for sustainable urban drainage, for biodiversity, for dealing with urban heat island effect. All of these things come under the sort of umbrella of urban greening factor, because effectively, the more you green a project, the less hard surface you have exposed, the less reflected sunlight that you have, um, and so driving things more and more towards a green surface has to be the way to go. Now, I once sat down and looked at one of our projects to work out over its of its surface area, 3-dimensional surface area, how much was actually within our domain, something that we could control.
Mm.
And the ground plane is normally quite a small component in the surface area terms. The roof area is bigger, but even with that, you're still looking at less than 30% of the surface area of a building being in the roof and the ground plane. The vast majority is, of course, in the elevations, particularly if they're tall, if they're 6 stories plus.
Mm.
So, in a way, to think that the elevations of buildings are ungreenable or shouldn't be looked at as a part of the sort of urban greening equation seems to me to be completely absurd. I mean, you're effectively saying 70% of our city is ungreenable. It has nothing to do with biodiversity. It has nothing to do with suds. It has nothing to do with urban heat island effect. And so we're just going to proceed, to just have brick elevations and cladding elevations and nothing else, which just seems a completely ridiculous approach to take. I suppose counter to that is my slight worry. I suppose because I get very sort of fixated on the sort of carbon issue, and so I just sometimes do wonder if all of our efforts to sort of green everything it means that we're sort of adding more mass into buildings, and particularly more concrete, which is obviously embodied carbon. I mean, I think at the end of the day, we have to accept that it isn't the issue. That the challenges for all of us over the next 2 years are not all about carbon. I mean, that's obviously a big issue, but there are many others. I mean, biodiversity loss is a problem, as is health and well-being. So all of these issues are all part of the same equation, I suppose, and we have to sort of factor those in and deal with them as best we can.
It is one of the hardest things in sustainability is that the fact that we're always comparing apples to oranges and making trade-offs. So
yes,
if you only go down the route of achieving net zero, reducing emissions, you might come to conclusions that are actually detrimental for biodiversity or for our health and our experience of a place. So it's sort of intertwined with the sort of social and environmental aspects of it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I thought when I look at our portfolio of work and I look at the portfolios of other officers, I think some of the environments that we're creating are not great. I mean, there are so much of fantastic. Elephant and Castle, which is this land lease development, which was one of the first C40 projects. Certainly, it was the first in this country, and probably one of the early ones globally. I mean, that is a fantastic project. It is just a great place to live, and I think in 50 years' time, it will still be a great place to live. I see other places in London, which I pass every morning on a train, and they are terrible. I mean, I really fear for those environments. They may be incredibly well insulated. The interiors of the flats may be fantastic, but the external environment is sadly lacking. It's all very well sticking a swimming pool on top of your building, but if what happens at street level is pretty stripped bare, then really you're not. I'm sure you've got your priorities wrong.
I went recently on a great walking tour with person called Dr. Julianne Futcher, who I will have on the podcast in a couple of weeks, I think. And her thing is urban microclimate, and she brought us on a walking tour through the city of London, basically, and just to try to explain to us how the different architectural forms create these different urban microclimates and that kind of thing. And what struck me was, even though I know the city of London really well, I've walked through it many times, I realized walking through on this occasion, we were almost constantly in shadow. And I came back with a collection of collection of pictures of dead trees at the bottom of
Really?
skyscrapers, because there was all these, gigantic skyscrapers with some tokenistic trees planted at the bottom who just had no chance at life because they were just dark, windswept, totally away from what would be the conditions that they would thrive, and they were just, couldn't deal it. And I thought, if a tree can't live in this environment, what
Yes.
humans
Yes.
have,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So
So, I mean, as I say, I think there are some excellent examples out there. So, yeah, I mean, there are some developers who have invested very heavily on the quality of their public realm. The Barclay Group certainly do. Lend-Lease definitely do. But there are others who, I would have to say that their investment in the quality of their external environment, and it's not just the quantum, it is the quality that it's all very well creating some big plaza, but if it's just windswept and uninhabited and not a great place to dwell, then it doesn't serve anybody.
it also strikes me that trees, areas of grass, planting areas that are planted and well managed, they're one of the only things that are universally accepted as beautiful and universally
Yeah,
loved by people. So it's
sure.
a great way to sell your scheme. If you have some very ordinary architecture, if you stick a lot of greening around it, people will really like it, and probably you'll sell much quicker.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing to do, obviously, is to cherish our inherited assets. So, we do have, certainly in London, and most European cities are the same. So, Paris certainly is, Berlin. We have a significant amount of natural capital,
Mm,
and whatever we do as designers, not within my working life, am I going to be able to offset the value that a mature tree that's lived for 50 years is going to have. So, I think getting people to sort of realize, the value that those inherited assets have is significant. I think also that getting people to understand what they need to do to keep a tree alive. So the
yeah.
reason your trees died, yes, it is microclimates. It's also because no one went and watered them for about 2 years. And
Yeah.
when you buy a tree, I always think that getting a tree to survive is a bit like the way that a pension works. That pensions work on the basis of compound growth. So basically, if you get 5% more growth on your pension than your your mate's pension, after about 10 years, it's not worth 5% more. It's worth about 50% more.
Mm,
And it's the same with trees. If you improve the growth outcome of a tree by 1, 2, 3% per year, after 10 years, you've got a tree which is got a canopy about twice as big as some poor tree that's not been looked after, not been tended well, was never planted correctly in the first place. So I think that idea of um, understanding natural capital and valuing it and giving it its best chance of survival is pretty critical to the way that we green assets. I mean, I think that there are people who've attempted to green buildings, and Bosco Verticale is always the sort
mm.
of classic example that people trot out. Well, there's a very good reason why Bosco Verticale is not all over the world. There aren't thousands of them, because there should be by now, since it was finished getting over 10 years ago. And it's too expensive. It's inaccessible. It's a fire risk, and so developers won't do it.
Yeah.
If it was the solution, we would all be doing it by now. But I'm afraid it was too clever for its own good. And in a way, I'm not even convinced it's sustainable, because to keep all those plants up there, you've got to use loads and loads of concrete. So
Yeah. Well, it comes back to that thing of like, just because something is green and it's full of, full of life and full of greenery, it doesn't mean that it's not it doesn't mean that its construction and its use doesn't cause loads of carbon emissions.
yeah,
Like
yeah,
those are two
correct.
separate things.
Yeah,
Sort of,
sure.
greening and carbon emissions, they're sort of related, but they're also quite separate. Before I go on to the final question, is there any other topics you want to bring up that I haven't sort of asked you?
I mean, I think that COP26 was interesting as an event. I didn't ever expect it to solve the problems of the world, but I think for those of us who work in the sort of natural environment, it was a bit of a step change. That it was the first time that natural environment, had was at the top table, and I think on the back of that, I mean, I don't think many people are aware, but the Environment Bill was slipped out there at the back end of COP26,
Yeah,
and again, it's a real game changer. That I think in the UK, I don't know if this applies to mainland Europe at the moment and to the States, but there is a real change in terms of legislation, which is forcing people now to actually consider the natural environment in the way that it should be considered, and not just as some sort of tokenistic
yeah.
intervention. That it has real value.
Well, that's good. I mean, I think it's we have to take the sort of positives from this, because something like COP can feel like quite of a letdown, because it's this big thing. We sort of expect it to come out and solve all of our problems, but actually, I think there was a couple of I did see a bit of. I mean, it's obviously not enough, but it is a step change from what was spoken about at previous COPs. And one thing that I saw a lot of was basically every major and minor country talking about the need for adaptation to
Yeah,
climate change and
yeah,
the need to
yeah,
finance that, and that developed rich Western countries should be the ones that do most of the financing, which I think is, ironically, the lack of action on mitigation over the decades means that, yes, now we do have to do a lot of adaptation, but it's good that they're waking up to it.
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So as a final question, I like to ask all guests same question, because I always get a different answer, which is, what would you like to see happen or change in the next 10 years to ensure we're sort of successful in taking action on climate change? And this can be about anything, really. And maybe you've
Right.
already mentioned it in the conversation.
Well, a bit in my last answer, but basically, I mean, I could say what we all want in a way, which is that we suddenly stumble across this new piece of this new process, or this new discovery, which just solves climate change overnight. In some sort of Marvel comic style, the carbonatron suddenly sucks in all the carbon,
Yeah.
and that would be, I suppose, from a personal perspective, and certainly from the perspective of my family, that would be great. But I think there's a downside to that, and the reason I say that, the carbonatron could solve carbon, but that's not the only problem. We have acidic oceans. We have huge numbers of species which are becoming extinct, and we have, in other parts of the world, we have major social issues, and so yes, you may solve the carbon crisis, but all of those other things would still be there, and in a way they would get worse, because at the moment, you know the sort of prospects for the elephant and the whale and the penguin are all front and center, because we're all concerned about our natural environment. And if
Mm.
suddenly the big carbon issue, the big sea issue disappears, then I suspect that people would lose their focus on those other issues. And I think from a purely sort of personal perspective, to be perfectly honest, Ross, it's probably the worst thing. The carbonatron could probably the worst thing that could have happened to me and to my profession. And the reason I say that is that, I've practiced for 50 years and been the second class citizen. Landscape has never been given any serious thought by anybody else in the development profession. The numbers. Well, every meeting I go to, I will sit there for 2 hours while they talk about where the cycles go, where the bins go, what are the heating system they're going to be using, and then after 2 hours, about our landscape, And finally, over the last 6 months or so, I think people are realizing that approach is not going to wash anymore, and so they have to get real and they have to start looking at nature not as some sort of tokenistic bolt on, some greenwash to their developments, that it's integral, and you can't ignore it. We've done things historically because we can do them. Now I think we have to do things because we should do them, and not do things that we shouldn't do. And nature is still so vital to this planet, and we shouldn't relegate it to being a sort of a secondary consideration, because it most definitely isn't. So the carbonatron, I'd say thanks, but no thanks. I certainly, if I discover it myself, I definitely won't be marketing it.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Chris. I've really enjoyed this conversation. I've gotten a lot out of it.
Okay, great.
Where can people find more about you online?
So the company website, which is, so if you go to Churchman Thornhill Finch, or www.churchmanthornhillfinch.co.uk, that's our website. And then my own email address is cc@churchmanthornhillfinch.co.uk. I do have a personal email, which is cc@sequester. So that's sequester. And .co.uk. So I'm also available through that Brilliant. Portal. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I'll put a link to your website anyway in the podcast description, so people can go in and click to that. I won't put your email address because then you'll get lots of spam email.
Okay.
That's what's happened to me, basically. So
okay.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much, Chris. It's been brilliant.